Hey, Keith Townsend, Principal of the CTO Advisor. But if you've been watching the sessions, you should know that by now, right? This is session number 2. We are going to first sip a little cup of the coffee, digest everything that Rebecca just said. If you're watching this on playback and you haven't watched the Rebecca Weekly keynote from the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure, I highly recommend you do that, whether it's the next day or under replay or eventually on YouTube. First off, thanks a lot for attending my virtual event and my virtual conversation. We're going to try and hit a broad number of sessions. I don't know if you've been following me on social media and hinting up to this session, but this is spurred on by basically the some of the largest companies in the world, the Walmarts, the JP Morgans, and now FedEx, announcing that they're at various stages of hybrid cloud, hybrid infrastructure. They don't call it hybrid cloud or hybrid infrastructure, but that's what it is. Let's break down each one of the use cases. First, back in January of this year, 2022, JP Morgan announced on an investment call that they spent $2 billion of their $12 billion IT budget, technology budget, on data center capability. It was inferred that this is basically, and not just inferred, it was talked about how they wanted cloud capabilities within their IT landscape independent of the cloud providers. So this isn't JP Morgan saying they're not using the public cloud. This is them saying they want the same capabilities of the public cloud but on premises. Recently, last month, the Wall Street Journal had an article in which they talked about Walmart now investing in the public cloud capabilities on premises or cloud capabilities on premises. And now they have this capability to move workloads from on-prem to off-prem, basically as their capabilities or their applications dictate. Now, FedEx has announced that they're exiting the data center. They're out of the mainframe business by 2024, and they're out of operating data centers. Now, I put emphasis on the word operating data centers because they just recently signed a 10-year agreement with Switch. This is FedEx, to manage their data centers. So my fifth grade math tells me 2019 they signed the deal, 2024 would be 5 years into the deal, and then they'll have another 5 years left on that deal to manage data centers. I hope you're not triggered that this is in reverse, but so if they have another 5 years on a major agreement to manage data centers or to outsource data centers, how are they out of the data center business? Well, again, the key term here that I'm triggering on is operate data centers. I was at HPE Discover last week I was at HPE Discover, and one of the big trends is HPE focusing on the Fortune 51 to the Fortune 2000 down to the top 51, the Fortune 51. So that in between space. I don't know if I said that right. So 51 to 2000 of the top 2000 companies in the world. Their premise is that those companies can't afford to spend the billions of dollars in development. They can attract, most importantly, the talent to move their data center operations from the public cloud into the private data center and back and forth as needed. This A16Z type of capability that has been kind of the holy grail of IT enterprise, at least since A16Z released their research about the cost of renting infrastructure permanently. All right. So Keith, we get that. The future of the data center is this capability. HPE is trying to provide it via HPE GreenLake. They're a little bit ways away, but they're trying to provide it via HPE GreenLake. We're in search of other vendors from Dell with Apex. VMware just recently announced VMware vSphere on premises, kind of on demand, where VMware manages your VMware vSphere infrastructure. How do the rest of us get there? Rebecca just talked about the importance of hardware. I've long talked about the skills gap between enterprises that have cloud native experts and those who can deploy Kubernetes on premises and then deploy an operating model that includes that across the public clouds, or taking VMware vSphere on premises and extending that into the public cloud and using that as your operating model. What does this look, feel, and taste like? And when we ask that question, now we're asking, this is how you know this is real, because my dry erase is out. But we ask and answer this question in the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure. It is the playground. It is the sample pod in which we use to talk about this enterprise IT story of migrating to the public cloud. This is meant to represent our data center here in Chicago. We started out with 3 nodes: traditional VMware vSAN cluster running VMware vSAN 6.7 and on Dell PowerEdge 730 XDs. This spinning Rust and SSDs for cache. This is pretty typical of what a enterprise would have deployed 6 or 7 years ago on premises, running COTS, standard off-the-shelf applications, and chugging along pretty nicely. And then we're kind of compelled by the pandemic to do something differently. When I say we, I mean the enterprise. We were forced to expand our ability to host remote users. Our overall data center capacity had to expand. I'm sure many of you are still experiencing the challenge of procuring hardware in these strange times. We bought a used Arista switch, 10 gig switch for $500. The thing is now worth $2,000 in the open market. The same thing for our Cisco gear has almost tripled in value since we bought the equipment. The enterprise data center, the private data center, us without purchasing muscle, and even those with some purchasing muscle, are experiencing supply chain issues and expanding our data centers. So we wanted to mimic that experience. So we connected our private data center via a 10 gig connection, cross connect, to the public cloud, and we ran VMware vSphere across the private data center and the public clouds. So up in the cloud, we had instances out in AWS, GCP, and the organization that sponsored the research, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And we showed you what it was like to run VMware on premises, VMware in the public cloud, and bring to life this story of cross-cloud management. VMware wasn't using the term at the time, but cross-cloud management, multi-cloud management with a VMware vSphere control plane. I highly encourage you to visit the website, the CTOAdvisor.com. The researchers still there, pull it down. It's still super relevant as to why we do that. So, or what happened when we did that. So, a couple of basic questions out the door. You're getting a hint to how the CTO advisor makes money. Just as I believe there's value in us sharing our experience doing the thing that you do in your everyday IT operations, I think there's value to IT vendors in connecting their stories or validating their stories through sponsored research or sponsored papers in order to validate their story to you, my content creator. This virtual event isn't sponsored by any vendor. It is purpose driven so that I continue to build trust and bring value to you, my content consumer. My theory is that if I keep bringing you great independent content, when a IT vendor comes to sponsor research and I give you something like the VMware Cloud Study and you find value from that, like many of the readers have, you'll continue to share my content. You'll continue to engage in my content. The more you share and engage in my content, the more I become a trusted advisor to you, and the more interested IT vendors are in sponsoring the content till we get to the point where we're investing or committing hundreds of thousands of dollars in upgrades and capabilities in the CTO Advisor private data center. Let me give you an example of that. So we had a pain point in the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure where vSAN became a stumbling block for us. We wanted to go from VMware vSAN 6.7 and vSphere 6.7 to vSphere 7.0. And I have mainly contract labor, and I asked my contract data center engineer, what would it take to make the leap from vSAN 6.7 and VMware vSphere 6.7 to VMware vSphere 7.0, because vSphere 6.7 will be end of life in just by the end of this year. And he came back with a quote for 60 or 80 hours just to research the firmware needed to support upgrading the legacy environment. That's a significant amount of money for this level of engineer. Not that he's not worth it, is that I could be better suited by paying him 60 to 70 or 80 hours to write the paper that we wrote on containers. You referenced that below or in the chat session as well. The white paper that we wrote on containers, I could have paid him to do that as opposed to researching the path to vSAN. We all have these problems. We want to consume our physical infrastructure as we do the as we do the public cloud. We don't want to worry about what does it take to upgrade from vSphere 1.x to vSphere 2.x. We want to worry about how do we migrate a application from a monolith to a containerized platform so that we can gain that capability that these large organizations have gained. And we'll get into that part in a minute. So what we decided to deploy was more of a traditional stack, this investment from our research in creating content. I think I'm using an HPE Green. We used HPE DHCI solution, which is backed by what's essentially a nimble storage array and two Intel Ice Lake generation DL360 Gen 10 plus. I know some of you guys and gals really enjoy the technical details. I don't care. I'm moving to a model where I want to think about capability versus the underlay. Rebecca will tell you that hardware matters. So yes, hardware does matter. My previous environment, 3 servers, my current environment, 2 servers, less power, less VMware vSphere licensing, more capability. I loaded it up with RAM. I went all flash on my Elytra storage array. And more importantly, or most importantly, is now that we have this capability, when we need to go from vSphere 7.0 to vSphere 7.1, we're just going to go to HPE and say, give us the firmware pack. Give us the automation that we need to automate the underlay so that we can simply hit upgrade. In our VMware vSphere control plane, and magically we're upgraded. This literally saves 50 to 60 hours of research in my small data center to do that. So we're moving to this more cloud-like underlay in the environment. What does that free us up to do? Well, we're kind of getting to 2.0 of this session, which is the complete modernization of the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure. Remember, we want the capability to move workloads from the private cloud to the public cloud, in between, etc. We want data potentially existing in the private cloud. What we haven't drawn out here is companies who are allowing us to have basically data clouds out in the public cloud, in which we can have processing done via our private data center resources or our public cloud resources. I want to be able to either throw VMs at that data, or I want to be able to throw serverless compute, analytic platforms basically at that data. This is the complete vision of the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure, in which I can take data and workloads and work across that. This is super complicated and outside of the scope for this conversation. So my good friend Joe Onisek in his session will talk about data gravity and the complexity of doing this. I'm more focused on this capability. I teased as part of the promos for this section, I teased how does the VMware Broadcom deal impact my desire to create this image. Well, first off, I wanted to restate that this problem exists whether I'm Walmart, JP Morgan, the CTO Advisor, FedEx. Doesn't mind the size of the company. If my desire is to run applications as I see best suited across the private data center or the public cloud, I have this core capability or this core question of how do I make that possible? Prior to the announcement that Broadcom was buying VMware, Google Cloud engaged us to do an interesting project. They wanted us to take our homegrown application that Alistair from V Brown Bag wrote called Obsidian. I'm going to misspell this. Obsidian is a monolithic application that was built on a lamp stack and designed to test our underlay. So if we wanted to test the IOPS on our Elytra storage array, or if we wanted to understand the impact of adding Optane memory to our HPE ProLiant servers running Intel Xeon scalable processors, or if we wanted to test remote VDI, Obsidian was that application that we built to do our internal testing. But one of the things that we wanted to do with Obsidian was also use it to expand out into the public cloud. While VDI in our first VMware Cloud use case was a very interesting application, it wasn't indicative of what most people are doing for remote access as we move forward. VDI is kind of what we've done in the short term. In the long term, we have to consider how do we give application or access to applications and data outside of our data center four walls. How do we expand capacity for a given application in different regions without needing to bring the heavy desktop model to each region of the world. Therefore, we built Obsidian. Google challenged us to take our Obsidian application, run their MFit automation tooling against it to understand what was the effort needed to move the application, and then use their M2C machine to container application or automations to put that onto Google Anthos. So that next level of, okay, I have an application, I've laid it down, I now have it in my private data center, and I now need to move it to the public cloud, but not in a lift and shift motion, because as we know, lift and shift is not a great long-term solution for moving to the public cloud. Yes, I can do vMotion from my private data center into the public cloud, but that's not sustainable. It's just a step function to moving to cloud native. So we have an application we want to move to cloud native. We have a cloud underlay in Anthos. We've done that work. I'm going to tease that we've done the work, the research, that sponsored research will come out in a few weeks or so once we get past the content creation part of it. But we've done it, it worked, and now it has us asking the question, well, what about the private data center? What if we wanted to move that workload back from Google Cloud back to the private data center? Is this a Anthos thing? Do we use Anthos again to move the application? Do we use VMware Tanzu? Do we use OpenShift? What is the platform for the private data center? Furthermore, how does that platform interact with the public cloud? Does the public cloud control the private data center Kubernetes distribution? Or does the private cloud control the public cloud Kubernetes distribution? Where is the control plane? Who owns the control plane, and how do we manage it? With VMware supposedly stepping away from Townsend, we don't know what's going to happen for sure, but the assumption is, just like HPE focuses on those top 2,000 customers for HPE GreenLake, I'm in a stronger camp that VMware is going to focus on those top 500-600 companies, as they did with Symantec, and as Broadcom has done with Symantec and CA and add these capabilities for those companies. And if the mid-market is somehow served by SIs, system integrators, or managed service providers, great. Life is good and we can move forward. But what happens if we're not served by Broadcom software or VMware software as Broadcom software will be renamed? What should we do? All right, so I'm going to reset the light board and we're going to talk about that problem and challenge. What are the options and what are we considering doing in the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure? So by the magic of editing, the whiteboard will be cleaned and we'll... All right, so we magically reset the light board and primed it for the conversation. Before we get to the fun workload stuff, we have to talk about the holistic people process technology perspective. So right now I have some technology on the light board, but before we talk about the tech, let's get people process out of the way. The people challenge is significant. I hinted towards where my struggles lie. I have really smart people working for me, and I'm sure you do too. And their priorities are a little split brain based on what I'm asking them to do. I'm asking them to modernize a data center, and at the same time, I'm asking them to embrace cloud native and this cloud-like capability on premises, off-prem. We initially tried with VMware Cloud on AWS and VMware vSphere on premises, but we ran into the challenge that if we want to achieve kind of this end vision of Tanzu and Tanzu application platform, that was an expensive and overkill for our setup. We already have overkill for our private data center. We don't need the overhead of VMware vSphere to run containers in the public cloud when there's options such as EKS, Anthos, and Azure's platform available to us. So we have to solve our people problem. Like, how do I get my people trained to use the right platforms for the right applications, for the right infrastructure, if that makes sense? Then process is also something that, again, as we scale, one of the things I like to tell people about my proof of concepts is they're exactly it. It's the equivalent of, did it run on my laptop? Well, it did. Or it didn't run. And here's where the problems were. And here's where we saw great capabilities and where this has some potential. But again, we can't even compare large infrastructures to other large infrastructures. We have to caveat that this is a small infrastructure and just a sample of what the environment will look like once you deploy your solution. So people, process, and now technology. We can't have the conversation about cloud and cloud native and multi-cloud, super cloud, hybrid infrastructure without having this conversation around data. I drew what I call my data infrastructure stack many moons ago, where you have your infrastructure itself. I picked up again, this is how you know it's real. I picked up the pen that isn't the marker that's not working. You have the data infrastructure itself. You have the access controls or access layer for the data. And then you have your interface for the data. And this all varies based on your different models of cloud. If you're using Salesforce, the infrastructure, the access control, and interface looks very different if you're using S3 and object storage, or if you're using file to access your data. The access control and infrastructure and all that is very different. You need to have a handle around that. How am I going to ensure the SaaS, the PII residing in a SaaS data environment, let's say Salesforce, is going to be the same, is going to have the same policy as my data residing on my SAP instance that's living on-prem, which is also going to have the same policy as my unstructured data sitting in file or object storage. It's a tough problem. In the storage panel later on in the day, they'll talk about some of these primary storage challenges and some of your considerations. There's the problem of data gravity. We drew the picture earlier in which we talked about if we're going to transact against data sitting in a cloud adjacent data store. The problem with that becomes egress costs, data locality, etc. Joe Onasak talks about that in detail for 45 minutes in his session following this session. And then there's the network. As we're considering this move away from, or potentially this move away from VMware vSphere, there's a gaping wound that we have to deal with NSX. NSX has become the de facto, sorry Cisco, HCI, but NSX has become the de facto layer of abstraction for a virtualized environment. Even if you're going all Kubernetes, using NSXT has been the preferred method for virtualizing networks. There's other solutions on the market, but we have to think about those other solutions, whether they're it's showing that I haven't looked at the space in a while, but Plum Grid, open source networking in general. Are we going to deploy NFV, network function virtualization? Are we going to deploy container network function virtualization? Two very different models, two very different sets of needs. I'll put a link down that I had a conversation with actually a couple of years ago with Ed Warnicki, who leads a lot of the conversation and projects around open source containerized networking. All of these challenges have to be addressed. How are we going to engage in network computing for the cloud environment? That's at the abstracted layer. Problems that we're thinking about in our data center is, well, what about the substrate? What about the underlay? How do we orchestrate the underlay in which I'm not creating the same people and process challenges that I had with my VMware vSphere environment, where I'm worrying about how do I update firmware on switches? What firmware is compatible with the overlay that I'm running? How do I troubleshoot problems on the overlay that may be related to the underlay? When we draw the picture of a overlay network running on top of a underlay and how we're magically making the underlay disappear, well, what happens when I'm pushing 100 gigabits through my physical network connection that I have from my vSphere host over a 10 gig uplink to the public cloud, and I'm overrunning that virtual network? That I need observability in that, and falling under the network, which typically falls under the network, is this concept of observability. What are we going to do for our Obsidian application to observe that. In our physical data center, in our production data center, I have all of my tools, vRealize, etc. When there's slow application performance, I can go to these go-to tools to look at disk IOPS, wait times within operating systems, what processes are running, do I have a noisy neighbor on my VMware vSphere host, what's happening with DRS. I have all these tools to troubleshoot application performance in my private data center. Those tools don't necessarily translate into the public cloud when I'm doing serverless containers and there is no OS, or I'm consuming services and I have a slowdown in a number of transactions. How do I trace that back to the underlay? These are all very good questions that we have not answered yet in the CTO Advisor Hybrid Infrastructure. One of the attempts to answering this question, we did a sponsored piece of content or sponsored piece of research with Juniper and their Abstract solution, which abstracts away the underlay, similar to the way that VMware vSphere abstracts away the underlying compute. I can create VXLAN configurations or blueprints for VXLAN configurations that I can deploy across all Cisco network or across all Juniper network. But it is a lift to move my operating model, people, process, and technologies, to move away from the command line interface and operating in that model. And again, I have limited resources. So do I have to hire a CCIE or a Juniper expert to run my infrastructure to give me the cloud-like capability that I need at the underlay, that I need at the network overlay, so that when I move application from a VPC in AWS into a on-prem infrastructure, that those constructs, auto scaling, network load balancing, all of that, all of those calls that call out to Kubernetes still works. All right, that gets us to workload orchestration. We talked about observability, we talked about the network, we talked about the data. We're back at the workload. So it's not just as simple as picking VMware Tanzu over OpenShift, over EKS, over Anthos. This is a question about how do we want to represent our cloud native journey in a way that is true to you. You're still going to run VMs. I'm still going to run VMs. My AD server, more than likely, I made the decision I'm still going to have Active Directory. My AD server is still going to be a virtual machine. My DNS server, I'm not outsourcing to Route 53, is still going to be a VM. How do I run those workloads and back them up? We just recently deployed Veeam. We've already ran Veeam, but we just adopted backing up our VMs or vaulting our VMs to immutable objects in AWS via the Veeam console. I could move to Veeam for AWS 5.0 and carry that same piece. But again, Veeam doesn't back up all AWS services. I just talked to AWS doing HPE Discover, in which they talked about AWS Backup, which backs up 12 services. So do I move to AWS Backup versus my Veeam Backup, which we've standardized, which I have more than a year of? How do I ensure that I can recover a file from a year ago if I'm legally required to recover a file from a year ago into this new infrastructure workload? What are we doing about the overlay? I'm literally asking myself this question over and over and over again. And this is why it's so difficult to move from VMware vSphere if you're a large enterprise. I talked about us mimicking the large enterprise. We're still, in comparison, it ran on my laptop. My hundreds of thousands of dollars is equivalent to saying it ran on a laptop to a million, to a IT organization spending $1 million a month in AWS. How do we answer these big operational questions around people, process, and technology? We've done a little bit of this research in our container white paper, which I'll link in the chat session, as well as our VMware Cloud session. And this is just for you who have not gone down much of this journey of hybrid infrastructure. We ran VMware vSphere 6.7 in the cloud. We've run VMware Cloud on AWS, Oracle Cloud, VMware Engine, the Google Compute VMware Engine. And when I get into VMware vSphere, it's all VMware vSphere. But when I want to do something like deploy a load balancer, well, that's an AWS construct, or that's an Azure construct, or that's a Oracle construct. If I want to expand storage, it's not as simple as going into vSphere and saying expand storage. Something has to be done with the hardware equivalent of the underlay in the public cloud. Those problems still exist when you're thinking about migrating to Kubernetes from a overlay perspective. Even if I chose Anthos and outsourced the bits of upgrading and managing Kubernetes, I still have this problem of how do I connect the Anthos network constructs to the Palo Alto that I'm running on-prem, or my Fortinet that's running on-prem or in a virtual machine. How do I handle security boundaries from I'm running Lambda in AWS and I'm running my Obsidian MySQL on premises, and I need to give rights to the Obsidian database to the Lambda thing, both in the application, it gets to our data infrastructure to Lambda, and I no longer have a firewall as a single point of control. Now I'm looking into things such as software enabled data protection and data enablement. I'm delaying but my Kubernetes network services to abstract away. So I'm looking at companies like Glueworks, Solo, HashiCorp, etc., to solve these problems that I was depending on if I'm a large enterprise customer for VMware to solve. Service mesh is the term that I'm looking for. Thank you very much for those of you in the chat that updated me. I'm just assuming that you've updated and kept me honest. I only have a couple of minutes left, and I'll try and wrap up. I started a series, TSIH. This stuff is hard because this stuff is hard. This isn't this isn't a lift and shift to the public cloud, in which I'm just taking VMs from on-premises and running it in the public cloud and kind of running my public cloud as a data center. This isn't even replatforming my applications from VMs to consuming AWS control plane. If I want this cross-cloud, this multi-cloud operating model, I have to create a cross-cloud or multi-cloud substrate, whether it's Kubernetes or some other solution, and deploy that across multiple clouds and manage that across multiple clouds while at the same time replatforming my applications to take advantage of those infrastructures. Over the past 2 years, we've done the easy parts. We've taken our data center and migrated it from power hungry Gen 1 Xeon scalable processors to Gen 3 Xeon Ice Lake processors with a much more agile infrastructure and our ability to expand the infrastructure. We've connected via 10 gig networking to the private cloud. I can turn up anywhere up from a 1 meg connection to a 10 gig connection over Megaport or Mega Path to the any one of the public cloud providers, basically at a few button clicks. We've done the vMotion from our private data center to the public cloud. We've even done application modernization. But this nirvana that Walmart claims to have achieved, that JP Morgan is achieving, that FedEx is heading for, we're in the throes of working that through. And I'm no longer convinced, or I don't know if I was ever convinced, I'm no longer convinced that VMware is now going to lead the charge in helping us with smaller infrastructures figure this out. It's just going to take a lot of help. I'd love to know what you're doing, whether it's in the chat, on Twitter, at CTO Advisors, this Twitter handle. I'd love to know what you're doing to solve this overall problem. Even if you've embraced VMware's Tanzu 100%, it doesn't get you 100% there. There's a lot of unknowns. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? In the chat section below, if this session's end, feel free to head over to the networking lounge. I'll be hanging out in both that lounge and Joe's session. We have another 15 minutes before Joe's session. Join the conversation on Twitter. Hashtag CTOAVC. Talk to you in the chats.